right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today, we're taking a deep dive into the EU's NIS2 directive. You've probably heard bits and pieces about it, but
Yeah.
this is way more than just another tech regulation coming down the pike. We're talking about protecting, like, the whole foundation of our digital society here.
Yeah, what's really interesting about NIS2 is that it's really pushing organizations to completely rethink, like, how they look at cybersecurity. It's not just a box to check anymore. It's about making sure your organization can actually survive, in this digital world that's getting riskier all the time.
And the clock is definitely ticking because October 17th, 2024, that's the drop dead date. That's when NIS2 comes into full effect. We're
Yeah.
talking about over 150,000 companies across 15 sectors that are all scrambling to get ready. I mean, energy giants, research labs, even food suppliers. Nobody gets a pass on this.
Yeah, the scale of this directive is huge. It's a very clear signal from the EU that cybersecurity is no longer just some niche concern for the IT department. It's, a boardroom issue.
Yeah.
And there are going to be very real, very serious consequences for those who don't take it seriously.
Okay, so let's break it down a little. NIS2 replaces its predecessor, the original NIS directive. So what makes this new version, like, so different, so much more impactful?
Well, NIS2 is all about expanding the scope of what's covered and getting a lot stricter about enforcement. It also introduces this really important distinction between, like, essential and important entities. And each of these categories, they have their own, very specific requirements and potential penalties for not meeting them.
So essential versus important, what does that actually mean in the real world? Can you give us an example?
Okay, so picture a major power plant, right? That's definitely an essential entity. A cyber attack on a power plant, I mean. That could trigger massive blackouts, hospitals would be disrupted. It could even lead to loss of life, right? The potential consequences they're just catastrophic. So those essential entities, they're going to face the highest level of scrutiny from regulators and the absolute most severe penalties if they don't comply.
That makes sense. So then what about an important entity? How's that different?
So think about, like, a regional transportation company. If they get hit with a cyber attack, yeah, it could disrupt commutes, delay deliveries. It would be a mess, for sure. But the impact wouldn't be on the same scale, right? Like, we're not talking about a total meltdown of the power grid or anything. So they still need to comply with NIS2, absolutely. But the level of scrutiny and the potential penalties, they're adjusted accordingly.
Okay, so different levels of risk, different stakes. But everyone still needs to be paying attention. So what actually happens to companies that just don't comply? I mean, we're talking fines, right?
Oh, fines are just the beginning, honestly. It's not just about the financial hit. Imagine what a data breach does to your company's stock price or your brand reputation when the news gets out that it could have been prevented. And for those essential entities, it can get even worse. We're talking about the potential removal of leadership, like CEOs and board members. They can be held personally accountable.
Wow, that's serious. So cybersecurity isn't just a tech problem anymore. It's a career-defining issue for anybody in a leadership position.
Absolutely. NIS2 it's forcing a major cultural shift. Cybersecurity has to be a top priority in the boardroom.
So let's talk sectors for a minute. Who exactly is impacted by NIS2?
Well, you've got your obvious ones, right? Energy, transport, healthcare, banking, all the critical infrastructure that keeps society running. But in NIS2, it goes a lot further than that. There are some sectors you might not expect to be included.
Okay, so, like, who? Who are the unexpected ones?
Well, for example, research organizations. They're holding huge amounts of sensitive data, intellectual property, personal information, all kinds of stuff. That makes them prime targets for cyber espionage. And then there's the entire food supply chain.
Wow.
Think about it. A cyber attack on a major food distributor could completely disrupt deliveries, lead to shortages, price spikes, even impact food safety.
Wait, food? Seriously? That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Right. It really shows how interconnected everything is in our digital world. Every sector, every organization, it's all a potential target. And the consequences of a cyber attack, they can spread way beyond that initial point of impact.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see why NIS2 is such a big deal. We've got this broader scope, higher stakes, stricter enforcement than ever before. But what does it actually mean for companies? What are the concrete steps they have to take to comply with all of this?
Well, that's where those 10 minimum cybersecurity measures come in. These are the non-negotiables, the absolute baseline for NIS2 compliance. It's like, think of it as building this digital fortress to protect your organization's most important assets.
A digital fortress. I like that. Let's break down those 10 measures. So what's the first line of defense in our digital fortress here?
Well, first and foremost, you absolutely have to have a thorough risk assessment. And this can't just be a check-the-box exercise. You have to really understand your organization's specific vulnerabilities, where are the potential points of failure. Yeah, you have to look at it strategically. It shouldn't be a generic one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
So it's about getting really granular, right? Like,
Yeah.
what are the specific threats that your particular organization is facing?
Exactly. You got to ask yourself, like, what are your most critical assets? Where are your weakest points, security-wise? What kind of data do you have that would be like gold to attackers? Once you have a really good handle on the risks, then you can start to develop, really targeted security policies to address those specific issues.
And those policies should cover pretty much everything, right? From like basic password management all the way to, encryption and how to handle a security incident.
Yes, absolutely. It's about creating this like comprehensive framework, right?
Yeah.
For cybersecurity, it's got to cover like the technical safeguards, but also how people actually behave, because let's be honest, most cybersecurity breaches still come down to human error, even with all the fancy tech we have now.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, we've all clicked on a link we shouldn't have or fallen for one of those phishing scams,
Exactly. It's like that old saying, the weakest link in the security chain is usually the human one.
It's so true.
And that's why NIS2 is really big on, regular cybersecurity training for everybody.
Yeah.
From the CEO all the way down to, the newest intern. It's about creating this whole culture of security awareness within the organization so that everyone understands the risks and takes personal responsibility for protecting that sensitive information.
So we've got the risk assessment, we've got our security policies in place, we've got our employees trained, and they're all being super vigilant. So what's the next layer of protection in our digital fortress here?
Okay, so even with the best defenses in place, breaches can still happen, right? Attackers are constantly getting more sophisticated. They're always finding new ways to exploit weaknesses. So having a rock-solid incident response plan, that's absolutely essential. You have to be prepared.
Yeah, so it's not just about preventing attacks. It's about, like, knowing what to do when something actually does happen, right?
Exactly. Your incident response plan, it needs to lay out, like, very clear steps for how to detect, contain, and recover from an attack. Like who's in charge of what? How do you communicate with stakeholders, both internal and external? How do you restore your systems and your data? You need to have all of that figured out ahead of time.
I bet that's where those regular data backups come in, right?
Right.
Having a copy of all your crucial data, stored somewhere, secure, off-site. That could be a total lifesaver if you have a cyber incident.
Oh, absolutely. Backups are your lifeline in a situation like that. They let you kind of rewind the clock. You can restore your systems to a point before the breach, so you can minimize the damage and the downtime.
Okay, so we're starting to build this multi-layered defense strategy here, but NIS2 also goes into specific technical measures, right? What are some of the key technologies that organizations absolutely have to implement?
One of the most important definitely is multi-factor authentication. Think of it like, having two locks on your front door. Even if someone manages to pick one lock, they're not getting in without the other one.
Okay, so even if an attacker somehow steals a password, they still can't access the important systems without that second factor of authentication, like a code from an app or like a biometric scan.
Yep, exactly. It's a really simple measure to implement, but it's incredibly effective at making it much harder for attackers to get in where they don't belong.
And then, of course, there's all this stuff about cryptography and encryption, which always sounds a little bit like something out of a spy movie to me,
Well, imagine your data, right?
Right.
Traveling across the internet, picture it like a postcard.
Yeah.
Encryption is like putting that postcard in a secure envelope that only the intended recipient can open. So even if somebody intercepts the postcard, they can't read what's on it.
Yeah, so even if someone gets their hands on the data, they can't make sense of it without the encryption key. It's like a secret code that only the right people know.
Exactly. Cryptography is all about creating and breaking codes. And encryption is, how you actually use those codes to keep information safe. And NIS2 requires organizations to use strong encryption to protect their sensitive data, both when it's being transmitted and when it's just stored, at rest.
So far we've talked about risk assessments, security policies, incident response plans, data backups, multi-factor authentication and encryption. Is there anything else we need to add to our NIS2 checklist?
Yeah, there's more. NIS2 also makes a big point about the importance of secure system procurement and development. What that means is making sure that any software or hardware that you're bringing into your organization, that it meets certain security standards, right from the start.
Yeah.
Now, your development processes, they have to include security consideration from the very beginning, the design phase.
So it's not just about securing your own systems, right? It's also about making sure that anything you bring in from the outside isn't going to introduce new vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. Security has to be part of every stage of the technology life cycle, from the initial design and development all the way to procurement and deployment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then there's supply chain security, which, that's become a much bigger concern lately with all those high-profile attacks targeting software companies and service providers.
Yeah, that's a big one, and NIS2 recognizes that. Your organization's cybersecurity is only as strong as the weakest link in your entire supply chain. So NIS2 actually requires companies to assess the security practices of their suppliers and make sure that those suppliers are meeting those same standards.
So you have to be sure that the companies you're working with, they're taking cybersecurity as seriously as you are.
Exactly. You need to understand the risks that come with working with those particular suppliers. And then, take steps to mitigate those risks. Like maybe you include some clauses in your contracts that say they have to meet certain security standards, or you conduct audits of their security practices, or even diversify your supply chain so that you're not so reliant on any one vendor.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We walked through all 10 of those minimum cybersecurity measures, from risk assessments to securing the supply chain. But I'm sure there are still folks out there who are thinking, how am I actually supposed to do all of this? Where do I even start?
That's a great question, and that's where it gets real, right? This is where you actually have to put NIS2 compliance into practice. But the good news is that organizations don't have to figure it all out on their own. There are tons of resources available to help guide them through this.
Right, there are those guidance documents and those cybersecurity frameworks and all those industry best practices, right? And then there's a whole bunch of cybersecurity consultants and service providers out there who can offer their expertise and support.
Exactly. And the key thing is to start early, be proactive, and take a systematic approach. Don't wait until the last minute, and then scramble to try to become compliant. Really try to embed cybersecurity into your organization's DNA.
Yeah, don't let NIS2 compliance turn into a fire drill. It's a chance to really improve your whole cybersecurity posture and build resilience for the long term.
I totally agree. The more prepared you are, the less overwhelming this whole process is going to seem. And remember, good cybersecurity, it's not just about compliance, right? It's about building trust with your customers, protecting your brand's reputation, and making sure your business can be sustainable for the long term.
Excellent advice. Okay, listeners, we've given you a lot to think about today, but before we wrap things up, we want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. Because even though NIS2 is really focused on these 10 core measures, the truth is, the world of cybersecurity, it's constantly changing, right?
Yeah, it's like NIS2 is a stepping stone. It sets a new baseline, a new minimum level for cybersecurity, but the journey doesn't stop there.
So what other measures might be needed down the road, to make sure that we stay secure? What new threats are coming? How do we keep ahead of the curve in this digital landscape that's always changing?
Yeah, it feels like with this NIS2 stuff, we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about the ripple effect that NIS2 is going to have. As more and more organizations, especially those that operate, globally, as they start to align with these standards, it's really raising the bar for cybersecurity, not just in Europe, but worldwide.
So it's not just about, checking off those boxes for compliance in the EU. It's about setting this new standard for best practices everywhere.
Exactly. It's going to encourage more collaboration and information sharing, between governments and industries across borders. And that kind of collective action, it's absolutely crucial if we're going to stay one step ahead of the bad guys.
Because, the threats are constantly evolving. The threat landscape is changing at an alarming rate. What kind of challenges do you see coming down the pipeline? Well, cyber attacks, they're just getting more and more sophisticated all the time. We're seeing a lot more targeted attacks and more use of artificial intelligence by attackers, to kind of automate their attacks. And there's a big focus now on exploiting those vulnerabilities in the supply chain we were just talking about. Plus, there's this looming threat of quantum computing, which I mean, it has the potential to completely break a lot of the encryption algorithms that we rely on today.
Quantum computing, yeah. That's a little bit scary when you start thinking about it. It feels like we're always playing catch up with these attackers.
Yeah, in some ways we are. But NIS2, it's laying a really solid foundation by encouraging like a proactive approach to cybersecurity and a collaborative one. It's really creating a framework for both innovation and resilience in this space.
So what kind of innovations do you think we'll see in the next, 5, 10 years? What's going to be the next big thing in cybersecurity?
Well, AI is going to be huge, not just in detecting and preventing attacks,
Yeah.
but also in taking over a lot of those tasks that security teams are doing manually today. We're also probably going to see some, much more sophisticated approaches to threat intelligence sharing, which would allow organizations to learn from each other's experiences and get ahead of those new threats before they become a huge problem.
And maybe, hopefully, we'll even see some breakthroughs in quantum-resistant cryptography, because we really do need to get ahead of that curve.
Yeah, for sure. Researchers are already working on new encryption algorithms that can hold up against, the power of quantum computers. It's a really, really exciting time to be working in cybersecurity because the stakes are high, the problems are complex, and the opportunities for real innovation, they're endless.
That's pretty cool. All right, listeners, there you have it, our deep dive into the NIS2 directive. We've explored the reasons behind it, what it covers, and how to actually achieve compliance. We talked about the expanded scope, tougher enforcement, and those 10 crucial security measures that are at the foundation of all of this.
And more importantly, I think we've talked about what NIS2 really means in the big picture, how it's changing the whole landscape of cybersecurity, pushing innovation, and encouraging a much more collaborative approach to protecting our digital world.
So hopefully you're leaving today feeling a little bit more informed
Right.
and maybe even a bit inspired to, step up your own cybersecurity game.
Definitely. Remember, knowledge is power, right? The more you know about how the threat landscape is evolving, the better prepared you'll be to stay safe out there.
So keep learning, keep asking those questions, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in cybersecurity.
Because in our digital world today, complacency is not an option.
That's the truth. And on that note, we'll leave you to think about what the future holds for cybersecurity. What role will you play in building a more secure and resilient digital world for all of us? Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.